Medical School. He completed his neurosurgery residency at USC and LA County Hospital and was on the faculty at the University of Maryland and then Boston University, where he became chair of neurosurgery. In 2011, he moved to Upstate Medical University and became the Robert B. and Molly G. King Professor and Chair of Neurosurgery. In 2019, he became the Dean of the Norton College of Medicine. His clinical and research interests are in brain tumor and traumatic brain injury. He enjoys flying a single-engine plane and playing drums in a rock band. So, Dr. Larry Chin, please say hi to everyone, and you can get started whenever you are ready.
Well, thank you very much, Ying. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to share elements of my story and introduce some of the concepts of leadership with all of you. So let me share my screen here. Okay. Great. Can you see the slideshow? Great. Okay. Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here, and let me see if I can not have this glare.
Lawrence Chin. He's the Dean of Norton College of Medicine. You know where that is?
So let me first start, and I will give you an outline of what we're going to talk about, and then we'll start to go through it. So I thought we might start with, I'll just tell you a little bit about my particular journey. And because I think, it's always natural to be curious about people who have gotten to certain points in life, and hopefully I can serve as a role model for you. And so you might want to know a little bit about how I got here. And then I'm going to talk about different elements of leadership. So we're going to start and talk about some of the common archetypes of leadership, different styles of leaders. I'm then going to discuss what are the specific elements of leadership, at least from my standpoint. And we're not going to talk about everything. And so I will try to make clear the things that I'm going to focus on and things that I'm not. I'm going to put a fair amount of energy into talking about strategy and strategic thinking, because I think that is an important element of leadership. I'm going to touch very briefly on what some people have called the bamboo ceiling, and then end with maybe some personal observations and a little bit of advice. So let's get started. I think you'd asked for some pictures, and I did this fun interview with Ying, and so I just collected some of the pictures from various points in my life, and so I was born in Seattle, Washington, and my parents were immigrants from China, and they met in school at the University of Washington. So that's where I was born. And actually, an interesting thing about my life is that I spent, after I was born, 3 years of my life actually in Taiwan. And so I moved back to the US when I was 4. And so in a way, I'm kind of a funny hybrid of, being born in the US, but when I came back, English was not my first language. I was already speaking Chinese. So, I think that's just, we're all immigrants in some respects, and I think that it's interesting to have that kind of early experience of really coming to the U.S. and really being like many immigrants, not knowing the language, even though I was, only 4. And I would say that I had a pretty typical suburban life. And as you can see from the picture on the left, I had the very bad haircuts from the 1970s. And I can only blame my mother for letting me be seen in public and get pictured with that kind of hairstyle. So, I would say that really from the standpoint of, if you're thinking about leadership, I had no aspirations of being a leader, certainly not through college, certainly not in high school or college or even medical school. So all of you are way ahead of me in that regard. It was really only in residency that I really started thinking about a life really beyond just studying and getting grades and kind of advancing to the next stage of life. And I would say that really one of the important things, certainly that happened to me, was finding a role model and a mentor and sponsor, kind of all wrapped up in one, which who happened to be my department chair. And so Dr. Marty Weiss, who was the chair of neurosurgery at USC, where I did my residency, was and is someone that I still look up to as really my role model for being an outstanding doctor, outstanding surgeon, a researcher and educator, and a leader. And so, having that kind of role model was really critical for me to start thinking about, well, maybe I can do more than just be a neurosurgeon. And I started thinking more seriously about, what are the things I need to do to learn how to, at that point, someday be a department chair like Dr. Weiss. And really that was my aspiration. I had never thought about going beyond that. Certainly never thought about being a dean. And so, this evolution in my life kind of happened gradually. But I would also say, in retrospect, as I look back, I also prepared for it. And I think that's going to be a key part of the message, is that being a leader is certainly not something that you're born with. People can talk about being a born leader, but I don't think that actually is, first of all, not very common. And I'm not sure that that's the best way to become someone who is thinking about leadership. Being a leader is a skill that you can only get better at with practice. So that's a little bit of my personal journey. This just shows me as a surgeon, as a department chair, and then ultimately, I think, the role that I have now, which is really working for the medical students and ensuring their education. So what is leadership? Well, in my mind, leadership is getting stuff done with other people. That's kind of my simple definition. And so here's a table that you might see, and it really talks about the difference between being what's called a manager and a leader. And I think, you know, the obvious point of this is that, well, it's much better to be a leader than a manager. So, you know, you could look at this, and basically a manager is someone that just gets stuff done and moves things around, but isn't particularly inspirational or visionary. And so I'm not going to take the time to go through all the elements on this table. You know, I think some of it is a little simplistic. But, you know, what I want to start to emphasize, and I think you'll see a theme through this talk, is that really things are a certain way and they're also not. And I think the key word is "and," so that there are elements of leading and there are elements of managing, and they're both important, because you can't just be a leader and not manage things. And you certainly can't manage effectively without doing all the things that you traditionally think of a leader being. And so the whole idea is that so many ideas are become very fixed and one-dimensional. And if you're a leader, you're inspirational and charismatic, and you know, you do things right. And so, you know, and that you're not a manager. And really the reality is the best leaders are also the best managers. And so I think that is really something that I want you to think about, which is there's no one single definition. There's no single correct leadership style. There's no single personality type that is best for leadership. The capacity really exists in all of us, and we're all different. So, but that being said, let's just look at kind of the common archetypes. Really, they're stereotypes, but as you'll see, there certainly is some truth to all of these. And I think that you know, as we go through these, you'll probably recognize people. You might recognize yourself. You might recognize a colleague or classmate. You might recognize a professor. So the first type of leader, and this is a common type, is the autocratic. And I put up a quote by Winston Churchill that is a little bit emblematic of this style, but it is basically the top-down command and control, right? You might think of a structure that has a great deal of hierarchy, such as the military. That is the classic autocratic leadership style, right? The influence of this type of leadership is really based on the title that you have. If you're the commanding officer, if you're in charge, because that's what the org chart says, that's the basis of your influence. And the people that report to you, and you tell them what to do. Obviously, you can see that this might be a situation where that might breed resentment. But also there are situations where this is very effective. And particularly, you might think that in a crisis situation, having this type of command and control, top-down communication can be very effective. And so, but this is certainly one common form of leadership. Another type is, some will call it pace setting. Others, you might think of it as leading from the front. And basically what this style is the person that leads by example. So again, it's a little bit of a top-down leadership style, but the pace-setting leader is the person who shows up at work before everybody else and stays later than everybody, right? It's the person that does more than everybody else, and in a way influences, or some might say coerces, others to keep up. So how can you not be expected to keep up when your boss is doing more than you? This is what I would say the influence. The reason I say it's based on expertise is that typically the person who's a pace setter is the one that knows more about the area, the field, than the others, and does more, is more of an expert, and is the person that's out in front and everybody else is trying to catch. And I think that, you could think of different leaders that might have this kind of style. Someone like, say, an Elon Musk, right? Lots of groups in Silicon Valley have this pace-setting type of leader, the person that developed the software, wrote the code, et cetera, a Zuckerberg. This can be effective if you've got a team of experts that can try to keep up with you. But this does not necessarily build loyalty, does not necessarily build relationships, and in fact is not really focused on generating relationships, but certainly could be very results oriented. Another style of leadership is what we would term the transactional. And so this is the type of leader where you're really basing the rewards on things that you can measure. And and I put a quote in by Steve Jobs. It has certain elements of a pace-setting leader who's out in front and demands the most, but it's also somebody who really relies a lot on metrics, and you reward people that hit targets, exceed targets, and you punish those that don't meet the targets. It is, again, a fairly top-down style of leadership, but this is certainly a very common style, especially in the corporate world. You see this very commonly, especially with leaders that are trying to turn around a company. You go in and you expect people to perform, and those who do get rewarded, and those who don't get fired. And so it's certainly a very goal-oriented style. It will absolutely create a lot of competition, and it probably inhibits collaboration, because if you are letting your fellow competitors do better, then that jeopardizes your standing, right? And so this is certainly an effective technique. and certainly is results driven, but does not necessarily build teams, and obviously has drawbacks. Another style is what we would term laissez-faire, and this is actually a style that you will see at certain segments of corporations practice this, where the idea is you hire the best people and then you just let them do their work, and your job as a leader is to not get in their way. And so this is a very decentralized, delegated authority model. The influence in this kind of system is really based on relationships between people. I think to some extent it's based on the expertise. Communication in the style of leadership is oftentimes minimal, and certainly in the right setting, this can encourage collaboration and risk-taking and creativity. And you might think of a company, say like Google, where it would be very common to have groups of people basically follow their own creative path, and they're given minimal direction, and they may come up with something amazing, or it may just be a dead end and a lot of wasted time and money. So, again, this is one of these high risk, high reward situations. But certainly when you're looking to adopt a style where you're looking for people to think out of the box and to maximally collaborate and to come up with unique things, it's oftentimes not bad to let good, talented people do their thing with a minimum of personal influence. The coaching style is certainly something that you will see very often when you have inexperienced groups, and I think that there is a certain element to every organization, every committee, every whatever group you are leading, where you have to have some element of coaching, because there's always going to be people that are new, and one of the most important things that you can do from a leadership perspective is to do succession planning. So if you're the chair of a committee or you're the president of an organization, you're not going to be in that role forever. And you don't want to be in a situation where all of the knowledge and experience leaves as soon as you step down, or you take a different job, or you graduate and move on. So the element of coaching and building teams and skills is really important for the long-term health of any group, and that long-term goals, the loyalty, building the culture, a lot of that comes from the coaching and educational side. A democratic leader is certainly a situation where you really delegate the authority to everybody else. And so, you might think of this as being similar to the laissez-faire. I guess the difference is a little bit in the process. So, I think when you have leaders that are very loosely organized or laissez-faire, there's still clearly the implication that the leader is the leader, and that while things are very loose and collaborative, that's because that's the style of the leader. In a true democratic system, there is no leader, and so, this is, I would say, not a very common way of doing things. Now, you might see this in certain kinds of startups where it's really based on what the group and the crowd want to do, or even those startups that don't have a leader, and the leader can be anybody. I think one example of that was Zappos, where basically there is no hierarchy, right? And so, this is a type of style where you could certainly build a team, and you can empower others, which many people find attractive. But it oftentimes, when you don't have that kind of guidance, you have companies or groups where nothing gets done, because if everything is based on consensus, that can be a very hard thing to do without someone guiding it. And so I don't know that this is that common a style, but certainly you do see it. The affiliative is really a style where you're really paying attention to the needs of the group. And I probably the classic types of groups are the ones where to some extent this happens in certain tech industries, right, where if you work for a company, they'll take care of everything for you, the food, your laundry, all of your personal needs, and it's an attempt to really build teams based on well-being. Well, sometimes that doesn't always work, or there's something behind all of the attention. So I think that this is probably in isolation something that isn't common, but it is something that you do see commonly in really outstanding leaders. The fact that they pay attention to the needs of their team members, and recognize the importance of that for a well-functioning organization. And then the last style is really maybe what people would consider this is what we all aspire to, the transformational leader. Really, it's the person, the visionary, someone that really influences because of their charisma, because of what they stand for, their ideals. And I think that, if you look at different styles, perhaps this is the one that that people certainly aspire to. It's the one that gets the headlines. So, all right. So now that we've kind of looked at all the different styles, I think one thing that I would like to emphasize is that there is no single one style for every situation. It certainly wouldn't be uncommon for someone to be autocratic in a certain situation and a coach in another. And that person could be always transformational and inspire through through their ideals and their vision. So how do we get to this point? How do you really start this process of being a leader? I'm gonna really hop around some different ideas. Some of the things are gonna seem like what am I talking about? And so I just ask that you bear with me, and we'll go on a journey to really a number of different areas, a number of different thoughts. But so the Temple of Apollo is a building in ancient Greece, and on this building were these maxims that were inscribed, and there were probably proverbs, and basically they were just aphorisms. But it's really interesting, some of them. And the first three are, the first is know thyself. The second is nothing in excess. And the third is certainty brings ruin. So I'm going to talk about 1 and 3. So, and remember, this is all kind of our leadership journey here. And so I'm going to talk about some of the different elements in leadership, and these are really my thoughts. So I don't know that there's really any book that kind of lays things out in such a way. And the things in red are the ones that I'm going to touch on in this talk, and some of the other things I'm not really going to get into, and maybe some of your other speakers will discuss. But the first element in leadership is really understanding yourself. So who are you? And like I said, there's no single leadership personality or style. Anybody can be a leader. And so, but I think it is important for that person to know themselves. So who are you? And then the second step from that is whomever you are, it is very important in leading groups to have emotional intelligence. And the so-called EQ is not the same as, general intelligence or IQ. It is really tied up with how well do you know yourself. And then we'll talk about the other elements, team building and strategic vision. But so here is one kind of self-assessment technique. There are many. They all have kind of the element of a personality test. So you can do these online, and there are all the multiple personality surveys, and this is one that I did as part of really part of my work at Upstate, and it's called a DISC, and it's basically finding yourself in the spectrum between a dominant style, a conscientious style, a style that really works on influence with people, and then there's some people that have more of a steady type of personality, and you can see the different elements. And like many personality tests, you answer a few questions, and then you get a profile. So this was me, and so I am very, and the way you look at something like this is the farther away you are from the middle, the more strongly you're associated with that particular style, and there's overlap. So I was, pretty firmly in the conscientious group, but shaded towards the steady. And I think that's probably a pretty fair assessment of my style. Certainly fit my personality as a physician. It doesn't mean that you can or can't be a leader. You might be a very dominant personality, or one that is very dominant and based on your charisma and ability to influence people. And part of this kind of assessment is also understanding how you might, if you're a conscientious, steady person, how might you react to somebody who has a dominant personality? And there are probably ways in which that can be difficult or stressful, and there are probably ways in which that can be very synergistic and opportunistic. But again, the key is getting a sense for understanding who you are and where you might fit in something like this. This is a book that this is certainly quite old now, probably 20 years old. A psychologist named Daniel Goleman kind of popularized this. But the study of emotional intelligence, or EQ, is certainly something that psychologists have been studying for a while. And I think that the key is that emotional intelligence is really all about how well do you understand yourself and how well do you understand other people or groups. So, and then, the next step after understanding is, how do you regulate? So if you understand yourself, how do you manage yourself? How do you manage those disruptive emotions? Or how do you manage change, if depending on how flexible you are? Having social awareness, you might think of that as reading the room. How good are you at picking up social cues, recognizing how other people are feeling? How are they reacting to you? How are they reacting to a situation? And then how do you manage that? Communication skills are important in this. Managing conflict is certainly a huge part of leadership, right? You're not going to get a group of people working towards a goal without conflict. There are going to be people that have different ideas. Okay, so after you start thinking about yourself and understanding yourself, the next step is really, how do you then work with a group, and how do you manage a team? This is another, was a very popular book. Again, it's been out for a long time now, probably 20 years. But it really summarized a whole body of psychological research about crowds. And in fact, one of the earliest studies into crowds, it was this short little paper in Nature, published in 1907, and basically, and you probably have heard about this, but the fact that that crowds are oftentimes much more effective in making predictions than any single person or any expert. And so, for instance, if you have, say, a jar of, whatever, a jar of marbles, right? And you ask people to guess how many there are. And in fact, this is the study that was published. Almost invariably, the mean of what the crowd thinks is extremely close, if not exactly right on the actual number. And so the idea is that there is some type of collective intelligence that arises from a group of people. And you know, and we'll explore that a little bit, but it does not depend on how individually smart somebody is. And it does not depend on having the smartest people or having one person that's super smart. In fact, it's something that arises from the nature of people with with a diversity of opinion and with some element of independence. So here's another interesting study. This was published in Science in 2010, and it was a study in which there was an attempt to measure the collective intelligence of a group. So you know that that IQ is a measure of general intelligence of a person, and is a factor or a number that can predict how someone might do on a certain cognitive test. I think we all recognize there are many different forms of intelligence, but that happens to be one, what you would call a general intelligence. Well, the hypothesis is that if you have a group of people, that you could also measure that collective intelligence. And so, in fact, the study was done, and in different experimental situations with different tasks, with different groups, they attempted to measure this collective intelligence. And it was really interesting. The things that were predictive did not have anything to do with individual intelligence of group members. And in fact, the collective intelligence was greater when you had higher measures of social sensitivity of the members in the group. It was higher when there was more equal distribution of people taking conversations. So not having a group where one person dominates it always. And very interestingly, the greater the proportion of women in the group correlated with higher collective intelligence. And that might make sense when you think that the idea of social sensitivity and collective taking in turns is something that oftentimes seem very natural with women in groups. And so I think this is really an interesting way of trying to quantify something that you might think would be difficult. Well, so that's how groups or crowds can really work well. How do they not work well? So certainly you have the idea that you could have mobs that are destructive. And so when is a group not likely to be effective? Well, certainly when you have homogeneous thought in a group. So again, not having that diversity, having, what I am calling informational silos. So not having free exchange of information, basically having certain people in the group have inside knowledge and others don't have that. You can imagine a culture of fear, a culture where it's not encouraged that people speak up. Again, that leads to the lack of diversity when you don't have people working together or independently. And groups can become very polarized in this kind of situation. The other way that groups fail is when you don't have transparency, and that's part of the informational silos, but also having a lack of a process. So if decisions and consensus and direction doesn't have a defined process, then it really is based on the whim of certain people, or maybe unduly influenced by someone who is very influential or powerful for maybe a good reason, but maybe a bad reason. And ultimately, when you have loss of these checks and balances, I think that's when you've got this failure of crowds. So, how do you build this dream team? Well, I think we've talked about most of these things, but it's really having this diversity of background and opinions, really allowing people to be independent, allowing people to specialize in areas so that there is individual expertise, but always making sure that there's room for dissension, that there's room for open discussion, and very importantly, that you have transparent processes, and leading to decisions, but not just any decision, but decisions that you can actually do something about. So having something that's actionable is I think very important. Okay, so that was the first maxim. The third one is certainty brings ruin. Now, what does that really mean? And what am I talking about? Certainty brings ruin. Well, I'm going to bring up a couple of other thoughts here, a couple of other books. There's a very short book came out in the 50s called The Hedgehog and the Fox, and it's the idea that there are two fundamental ways that people think about ideas in the world, and they're divided into the hedgehog and the fox, and we'll talk about that. And the second is the idea of who are really good at predicting the future, and this really ties into how do you lead and have a vision for a group, and how do you plan that strategy? Because a big part of that is how you view the world, and also how you predict the future, and how do you react to things as they occur. So I'm going to digress just a little bit and tell you about a historical event, and this involves the Persian king Xerxes. And some of you may know the story of Xerxes and the Spartans, the 300 Spartans, and Xerxes was really a king of the most powerful nation, and that was Persia, and commanded an army that was unsurpassed. And he very much wanted to dominate and rule Greece, and in part for revenge against his father, who was defeated by the Greeks. And so he summoned this massive army, certainly had the manpower and the firepower that far exceeded what the Greeks could put together. But part of this journey was crossing a very narrow body of water, and this is near what's now modern day Turkey. And in order to cross this body of water, he created this floating bridge, and basically, you can imagine this was somebody using the ultimate power and wealth of their country to do something that seemed unimaginable, to be able to transport this massive army across this body of water into Greece. And the idea is that this was a person that was single-minded in their vision, and would spare no expense and no human life in support of this vision, which was to dominate Greece. Well, obviously you could fast forward. He was defeated because of really the expense and the energy required to do all of the things in support of this one overriding vision and idea. And so from this is this quote, which is, "A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one big thing." And this was the subject of this small book by Isaiah Berlin, and continues on in the work of psychologist Philip Tetlock. And it's the idea that experts, when you look at experts and they're making predictions, experts are oftentimes very, very confident. You see this all the time if you watch news TV, or you watch people, political pundits talking about their particular area. They're always very confident. But when you analyze how good are these people in actually making predictions, they are oftentimes not very good. And in fact, oftentimes they make mistakes because experts are much less likely to acknowledge a mistake. And so, what this work has really shown is that the idea of the people who are foxes, so the ones that know many things, and not the hedgehog who only knows the one thing. So, for instance, Xerxes would be a hedgehog. You can really get into trouble when all you have of the world is a singular view. And so the idea that we live in a very complex world, and that there is a large amount of ambiguity and uncertainty, and the idea that to be successful in the world really requires open-mindedness, curiosity, and tolerance for ambiguity. And I think that is one important idea that I'd like to leave with you. The other is this quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, where he says that a first-rate intelligence is the ability to retain two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. So this really, again, is this theme of the very important word "and," so that not to have a singular view, but to recognize that there is an inherent duality in the world, and that things are oftentimes both and if you can understand and accept that level of ambiguity in life, it will make you much more effective. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategy, and of course, being a APAMSA, I have to bring up Sun Tzu and the Art of War. And I think Ying, you had asked me about my, a favorite quote, and this is one that and I think that it's an interesting, again, view that there are things called strategy and there are things called tactics, and they're both important. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. So if you've got a great strategy or a vision, but you have no idea how to pull it off, you may still get to that vision, but it's not going to be easy. On the other hand, just having tactics without strategy, without that vision, is the noise before defeat. So you have to have a vision. you have to have an idea of where you're trying to go. And I think that these two quotes really kind of illustrate a little bit of the duality that we've been talking about. It's not just strategy, it's not just tactics. You need both. So strategy, very simply, is describing the destination, right? And tactics are the specific steps that you need to take. And so I'm not going to belabor this. You can certainly read more about, individual elements of strategy and tactical decisions, but they are both important. So when you're leading an organization, I am sure if you're part of any group, you'll have a strategic plan. And in my experience, this is what happens with most strategic plans. They are very quickly become obsolete. And so, and why is that? Well, I'm going to talk about two things briefly. You may have heard of these ideas. We live in a VUCA world. And what does VUCA stand for? Well, VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And this was an idea that really came out of the U.S. Army war colleges, where they do war simulations. And it's really, and it became very popular in the really starting in the 90s. The corporate world really kind of latched onto this idea that we live in a VUCA world and we have to prepare ourselves for this, and that how we approach leading and strategic decisions has to take that VUCA world into account. Well, interestingly, there's been a modification of this, and this kind of new formulation called Bonnie came into started. This writer Cassio wrote about this, and I think that there has been a fundamental change in the world, and it really, you could say that COVID brought it on. I think social media, I think the world of fake news, unreliable information, maybe expertise, distrust. We certainly have seen that with COVID, and it's led to what Cassio calls Bonnie, which is we now live in a world that's brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. So what is this Bonnie? Well, so the idea is that things are really, it's not just that the world is volatile, but the world is actually unstable and brittle. And so I think COVID really demonstrated this, that a very small event in one part of the world, and you've heard of the butterfly effect, can lead to catastrophic failure. And that's really, that's what the definition of brittle is that it's something that can break all of a sudden. And so how do you deal with this kind of brittle world? We've also seen a tremendous increase in anxiety, and more than ever, people are worried about well-being and the rise of anxiety and depression, people leaving the workplace, and this only further exacerbates kind of the brittleness of the world. And certainly in healthcare, we're dealing with this, the staffing shortages, nursing shortages. 2 years ago, there was no thought that we would have such catastrophic failure of the healthcare system because there weren't enough staff. And so the third idea is nonlinear. And so things can occur completely out of proportion. And again, I think we've seen drastic changes in the economy, in the world, in healthcare, that really, again, I don't think we could have predicted. And then lastly, the incomprehensibility, which is interesting because we live in an information age. We live in an age really where AI has really dominated many of the things that we do. But yet, even with artificial intelligence, it is still unreliable. And there are still things in which artificial intelligence can lead to grossly wrong decisions and attitudes. And so that idea that we have to somehow interact with the world that is so based on data, but yet that data can be unreliable. And how do we manage that? Okay, so this is the last part here. And I'm going to spend just a very, very brief moment on the idea of the bamboo ceiling, because I do think that this is something that is, I think, rapidly we are outgrowing this. There's no question that there is always a certain perception that is based on race, especially when race is so physically external, and certainly members of the very large and heterogeneous Asian demographic are united in the sense that regardless of your ethnicity or origin, being Asian is something that you can easily be labeled with. And so has that, have we seen certain elements of this type of ceiling? Well, sure. If you look at the percentage of, for instance, Asians that are at the professional level and then to the manager level and to the executive level, and you see the numbers reduce, you very might well assume that that indicates some type of bias or some type of a limit. Here's a study that was done on Asians in academic surgical programs, and things have changed in the 10 years since, but at that time, in terms of leadership positions, it was still quite a bit lower than the numbers in, say, regular faculty positions. And here is an illustration of, if you look at the percentage of people at the assistant professor level, and the percentage of Asians being 14%, which is overrepresentation from population, but certainly in line or even less than, say, the percentage in medical school. And then you come to the level of chair or dean, and of course we do have Asian deans, so this number is outdated, but the general trend is still the same. There are fewer and fewer numbers the higher you go up in leadership. So to what extent is this a perception issue? Is this related to a certain way that Asians are perceived as far as leadership qualities or capability? That is certainly, there's certainly literature that that suggests that that is the case. But I guess I would submit that while this may be the case, it's certainly not a reason to not continue to develop and to work towards this. And we see more and more evidence that Asian physicians certainly are in more and more positions of leadership. And so I'm going to end with just a few of my own personal observations and advice for all of you. So first of all, unless you're stuck in a system where where it is the autocratic style, and if you don't have the title, you don't have any opportunity for being a leader. Don't worry about not having a title, because you don't need a title to be a leader. You have influence through your expertise, through the relationships that you can cultivate, and you don't have to be on the org chart as a leader in order to actually develop these skills. But it does require self-assessment, that know yourself element. I strongly recommend that you find opportunities to leave your comfort zone. Again, you can't get better at leadership skills unless you practice them. And you won't ever practice and get better if you don't push yourself to do things that are new or different. Absolutely critical that you find a mentor or mentors and get that regular feedback. And again, you have to have the courage to change, either change yourself or change situations. Well, how do you cultivate opportunities? Well, I would recommend that you say yes. There are little steps. Obviously, you need to keep current with your CV. I think it is very important to know your goals. I think in this world, we have to promote diversity. As you can see, diversity makes everybody smarter. And don't fall into the trap of thinking that this is a zero-sum game. Promoting diversity and helping others only increases the attention of the importance of diversity. And so it does not mean that you help someone else and that they will take your position. Remember, in this group of APAMSA, as an Asian, you are not the dominant culture in this country. And so the diversity of your opinion is critical. I highly recommend that you network. And when I say network without distinction, that means don't just network with people who are above you. It is also helpful to network with people that you might be mentoring as well, because opportunities are unexpected, and it's not always your mentor or your sponsor that finds you opportunities. And how do you make the most of an opportunity? Well, I strongly recommend that you not only get to know people, but you understand. You have to do your homework. Leadership is a skill and it takes effort. You have to prepare, and there are no shortcuts. It's preparing, it's doing things, it's assessing, and it's adjusting based on your assessment. And certainly one quality that you will see in all good leaders is that they are positive people. So finally, lessons learned. Ethics and honesty and transparency will never do you wrong. Those are always good things and will pay dividends. You have to trust yourself, but when you have doubts, you also have to pay attention to them. So again, this is the duality of things. You have to be adaptive and be aware, self-aware, aware of other people's. That is really, I think, one of the keys of emotional intelligence is the ability to be aware. And finally, leadership can be very lonely. So you have to find balance. That is absolutely critical. So I'm going to end with, of course, hero for many many Asians, Bruce Lee. Yeah, there's a great interview with him, black and white, from probably 60 years ago, where he talks about be like water, and I think it's a great metaphor for life, and it is I think certainly a good lesson for how to adapt to society, how to adapt to life, and yet still maintain your power and influence. So with that, that's it. I want to thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chen. That was a wonderful presentation and great insight. Before we finish, I would like to offer the next couple of minutes to our viewers to ask any questions they may have. Feel free to unmute yourself or just type in the chat. While I wait for a question, I'll get started on one, Dr. Chin, if you don't mind. So there are many personalities in medicine, and for those who may be more introverted, reserved, or soft-spoken, how would you advise that we still advocate for diversity and leadership roles for AANHPI professionals?
Yeah, well, that is absolutely one of the stereotypes and perceptions, that Asians are quiet and hardworking, and all of those kinds of things, which is true in some cases and not true in others. And of course, again, what difference does that make? Because there are many leaders that are very quiet, and there are certainly leaders that are would be described as introverts. I think that if your natural tendency is to be quiet, that's where leaving your comfort zone is really important. So you do have to push yourself in that respect. If your natural tendency is, well, I don't want to attend this networking event, or I'm not going to volunteer for this leadership position, I'm just going to I'm just going to work behind the scenes. That may be totally fine. And not everybody has to be a leader. Not everybody has to do these kinds of things. But if you have that desire and you want to, then you do have to push yourself. Just like if someone's a natural extrovert, then maybe they need to push themselves out of their comfort zone and, not have to speak all the time, right? So I think that it is part of the work of really leaving your comfort zone, doing something different, making a change.
Thank you, Dr. Chin. Oh, I also had a question. You referenced a lot of really good books that you've read on leadership. Is there a more current or like any resources that you use that helped you progress in your career as you advanced in leadership?
Yeah, well, there are lots and lots of books that talk about becoming an expert. A lot are in kind of the popular literature. So I wouldn't say there's a single book. I kind of listed a couple of things that highlighted the themes in this talk, but I think you want to look at stuff that works for you. So, how do you become an expert in an area? How do you think about having that ability to cultivate diverse opinions? There's a couple of books that really talk about people that were able to cultivate groundbreaking ideas. There's a book called Loon Shots that looks at companies and people that did extraordinary things. There's a book called Originals that, same kind of theme. People that really came up with original ideas that transform the world. And, what are some of the common things that a lot of it has to do with leadership style, a lot of it has to do with group dynamics. How do you get people to work creatively? So that I think that so there's really no single source. If you look, I guess, like Harvard Business Review has lots of leadership articles. Mostly I see them if I do a search on something and it'll pop up and then you can read it for free. A lot of it is really just comes back to this idea of, and it's really not that complicated. Know yourself. Think about how to build teams. How do you maximize people? How do you take care of people and cultivate people? And that's really, that's really the key.
Thank you, Dr. Chin. Any other last questions? If not, we have a post survey link that is in the chat. If everyone who attends could just fill that out really quick for us, that'll be much appreciated.
We've also dropped the registration link for our next session on 118 with Dr. Herbert Chen, Courage and Leadership. All right, everybody. I just want to thank everybody for coming in today and joining us. Thank you again to our wonderful speaker, Dr. Chin. We really appreciate your insights and kind of you architecting your thoughts on leadership and your own journey as well.
All right, great. Good luck. Good luck, everybody.
All right. Cool. Hi, Dr. Bealey. Are you still there with us? Let me end the recording.